Hello, comrades and relatives. Jen Marley here. We're back with our latest episode of the Red Nation podcast. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to our Patreon, starting at only $2 a month. This helps us run all of our programming. This uplifts the Red Nation. This uplifts the people and all of the campaigns we're doing. And you're also going to get access to all of our bonus content and all of our behind the scenes stuff. So please consider. Today, I am very honored to be joined by a longtime friend, amazing organizer and relative, Napoleon Marrietta. He is Akimel O'odham, and he just got his master's, and he has been I would say one of the leading voices in Native Palestine solidarity for a very long time now. And there's a very specific reason that is. But before we get into that, Napoleon, would you introduce yourself?
So, Skikdash, Ani Napchugik, Napoleon Marrietta, Ani Varakamaраtam, Thanatam, Pipash. And my name is Napoleon Marrietta. I come from the Gila River Indian community. My part of the area is in the northern area of the O'odham Jeweḍ, as we call it. And I'm Akimel O'odham, which is further south, and Pipash, which is also local here in the Gila River Indian community. So, I just finished my master's in American Indian Studies with an emphasis on Indigenous rights and social justice. And just happy to be here. Been a very big time listener of the Red Nation. And so it really does connect with a lot of the work that I do and others who are also doing a lot of direct action work, and also our solidarity with our Palestinian relatives. And that's a little bit about me. Also to add is that, I guess activist, sibling, but most of all, I'm a father. I have a son. And so those are just some of the things that about me that I hold very dear to my heart. Happy to have this discussion. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Thank you so much for making time. I know you're busy right now. You're actually at a conference, so I know you're multitasking and you're very busy. So thank you again for all you do. So I wanted to give our listeners some background. So um, we know that O'odham land exists. Essentially, the U.S. went and drew a border dividing your land. That is the U.S.-Mexico border. And so you all are in a very unique situation that many other tribes here are not. Can you kind of talk a little bit about that and the history of why your lands take on such a significance, in terms of geopolitics?
Yeah, for sure. So when one of the things that we mentioned, or I've heard described, different communities that rest along the border, so like border communities or border tribes or nations. And what we see is our entire, before colonization, settler colonialism, we had an entire um, vast amount of territory from parts of so-called Mexico to up here, and so in the South Phoenix area. So before that, we just known as just all O'odham Jeweḍ, and we had our traditions, our stories, everything that is connected to each of us, and you could definitely tell the differences between each community from dialect, different stories. So when the impact of settler colonialism, and then also the impact of the border, um, we started seeing the emergence of tribal governments, and now we have like our Gila River Indian community, Salt River, Pima Maricopa Indian community, a lot of the tribal government entities now separating into reservations, and now we have our relatives who are not federally recognized, the Hiyachid O'odham, who are a big part of our community, and a lot of our elders um, who live along um, sort of both areas have a hard time coming in, have a hard time going out. because some elders don't even have, you know, birth certificates and everything, because the history is so complex and the age of different community members pretty much outlasts. Some of them outnumbered the whole enrollment and travel enrollment and things of that nature. So I think once the border happened, we lost a lot of I guess traditional knowledge. There are bits and pieces that still impact our community that we're still trying to regain, and then also keeping a lot of our ceremonies intact as far as the being on this side of the U.S. Mexico border and the other side as well. So there's a lot of things that we try to share as far as history, because where I'm at, I'm pretty far from the Tohono Nation. We're pretty far from our relatives down south, and even further from our Hiachid relatives. And when we talk about our Hiachi relatives who are down there, it kind of seems like people will say like, "Well, you're all the way up there. Why are you worried about us down here? Or why is it you're Akimel O'odham, you're near the Gila River. Why are you worrying about our folks who are over the border?" It's like, well, that's because that's all our traditional homeland. We don't count that just because of this border or whatever. And I'm sure that's a lot for a lot of communities. We're looking towards the destruction of these borders, and visually, and saying those are our homelands. That's where our people are from. We're making the invisibility of this border as much as we can as possible, because of how we see it, how we have grown up to know the land. And so I think that's a big part of why, when we see foreign companies, foreign entities, and surveillance like Border Patrol, the integrated fixed towers, a lot of these surveillance things that are making us feel like we're terrorists on our own territory, on both sides. It really doesn't click with Western ideas or politics. Is because these things have been drawn for hundreds of years. Our reservations end in the border, and so I think that that's just a part of like our history, as what we're facing now, as we talk about things that are solidarity efforts of with Palestine, and then us as Autumn, and us to restore a lot of that, restore a lot of the things that were taken from us, even our own privacy. So
Thank you for sharing that. I mean, just in that bit alone, like you brought a lot of things to my attention that I kind of, I think, overlooked. One being the way, uh, something predatory like US blood quantum policies being used to divide up the land and make something like the construction of the border easier because of the way blood quantum policies are literally intended to divide and dissolve nations, right? It totally tramples our means of claiming our relatives and keeping those relations with ourselves, right? Another thing that I wanted you to speak to and unpack a little is the infrastructure of these watchtowers. So not only do they mirror the hostile architecture and tactics that we're seeing in places like Gaza, they are quite literally Israeli companies. Is that correct?
yes, that's correct. And more are um, always projected in policies to create more of the scarcity of what you call immigration. Um, and a lot of people like to hone in on that, and immigration this, immigration that. And a couple of times when we try to, a lot of people have tried in their work to get the the nation, the Donatum nation, to um, possibly figure out a way to. Um, I would say that it's disheartening, but work with entities like Border Patrol and try to alleviate a lot of these tactics in which when someone comes over, what that process looks like in terms of sanctuary, and things of that nature. Because essentially what we were caught, or a lot of people in the nation are caught into, is, you're dealing with three, international, the U.S. and then Mexico, and then sometimes people just overlook, the Tohono nation, which is literally right there. So it's always just between the two. So you never hear anything. Did you guys go to the tribal government? What's the process of that? If they're on our tribal lands, if they're in different areas in the community. So there's always like this kind of like, even if you are established tribal government on these foreign territories, and trying to look to sanctuary for folks, because we're seeing a lot of families, children, people, passing away there. So it should, why not have it in respects to the tribal government taking over that? And I'm sure it would be a way better process than being caught by Border Patrol, and how they abuse a lot of their powers against people that don't look like them. I mean, if it was because initially it would be within our own, our way of um, relationality with folks. We don't do what we've seen with the abuse of the federal government and everything, with how they treat immigration. That is not how we would. That's not how we would do it. And it's always our him duck first. It's always our people first. And initially, it would be trying to find out a way back home. How do we get you back home? These are the things that we're dealing with. Like, how do we get you home? And those discussions, I think that are needed, um, just because of where we're at right now. I mean, where we're at right now, um, because there's so much, it's a hot area there, and because of that, there's just small efforts to try to get that. And I think that was one of the discussions I've had with folks, is just, well, if you're Autumn, and they were the ones in charge of taking in folks and trying to figure out this process of getting them home, what would that look like? And it's like, oh, well, yeah, well, I mean, what was it like back then? We were always welcoming to people coming through, and then, whatever it is that they need sanctuary and stuff. And, well, what would that process look like? And then, a lot of people are like, well, that would have worked, because, they want the, A, B, and C, because that's the federal way of going through this dehumanizing process, right? Um, and what you mentioned, identity and all this stuff is blood quantum, and used to like that. Folks coming in, they don't know what that means. For folks just want a safe environment and a place to be. Um, and with their being surveilled and being a part of a huge project of colonialism, they us, we know what it's like. And then folks who are just trying to get to a sanctuary or a place to be safe is totally out of they're just trying to survive, and what we're trying to do is get them back home and feel that presence. And I think a lot of the border, even the checkpoints, even if you are a tribal member, even if you are, an indigenous person of color, you still get questioned. So it's like, and then people throw that out there. It's like, well, you're an enrolled member, you should be able to. It's like, even if you are, you still get harassed by Border Patrol. You still get asked, are you a U.S. citizen? You still get all these sort of questionable things of your vehicle, like your kids in the car. Who do they belong to? Like, you still get these outrageous, discrimination against, even if you are a tribal or non-tribal. I don't think they really care, you know. So I think that's where the sort of the hot take is right now, as far as where the relationship is between the border and all of them as in general. So thank you for that question. That's a good one.
Yeah, and thank you for really unpacking that for us. I mean, I think this shows like this particular situation that O'odham people are in really shows that the US at the end of the day does not see us as sovereign nations, no matter how much pretty words they want to use when they're meeting with our tribal leaders. Um, the fact that the O'odham nations are not treated as sovereign, entities, the fact that they're not treated as nations in conversations about, the border that literally dissects their land says it all. And it says, everything, about how the United States sees tribes. But also, um, like you said, O'odham people are simply continuing their traditions of solidarity and being good relatives, by caring about the relatives who are coming in, from Mexico and even nations from much further away, right? Majority of the people crossing the US Mexico border on foot are Indigenous people. Majority of them don't even speak Spanish, right? Is something I found out. They have to find translators sometimes within border patrol to speak their native languages because they don't even understand Spanish. And so that's something that I think people overlook a lot, that this is a matter of us maintaining relationships with relatives that we've already had, right? But also, you talking about this idea of home, right? We know that these are climate change refugees, they're political refugees, right? They're fleeing because the United States overthrew their government, or because the United States um, is profiting off of you know predatory, is profiting via extractive companies, whether that's gas and oil, or like the fruit companies, right? Like Chiquita Banana, the avocado companies, all of the things that happened after the North American Free Trade Agreement that displaced people, that destroyed local economies. And so people are literally coming here, fleeing the violence inflicted upon them by powers in the global north, like the US, and because of the climate change that powers like the United States are overwhelmingly responsible for too. And so, and I've seen, like, the papers and the, articles about O'odham people offering water and offering food, right? Being good relatives, just being a human being, and then getting criminalized for it too, right? And so, I think as people are looking at, the crisis of inhumanity that the United States is inflicting upon migrants, fleeing the damage that the United States is responsible for, O'odham people show us a better way to be, and they are really literally guiding us in how to make right relations and to provide sanctuary and to think about these things in a bigger way for what they are, but like most importantly, keeping that care at the center of how you approach.
Exactly, and it's about. I think what when we talk about like immigration policies and all this stuff, none of it says just taking care of humans again, giving them humanity, and that could be across the board. Palestinians is about humanity again, and the indigenous thinking of that worldview. You come from a place, and you there's a reason why you're here, and not a lot of people push on that. They just think oh, that's just wishy washy. What do you mean by that? And you have to really have that sort of knowledge, and that's where our elders and folks who know more than these like policies that they produce, and every hand that the U.S. has had in this thing is dehumanizing, and that's where it's like when we're hearing is just giving people their humanity back, treating them like humans, you know, everyone's always perplexed. Like, what do you mean by that? What does that even look like? You're like, well, I mean, have you been to a tribal? Have you talked to elders? Have you been a part of these things? I mean, I think that's what initially what we're seeing. A lot of that is just, if we're doing it this way, we got to have our elders or people who know the restoration of humanity, of their being, and making them whole again. Like you said, they're fleeing for survival. They're just trying to get day to day things of food, water, and we've done that ever since before colonization. We've always taken care of our relatives, even if they were Autumn from Gila River or Salt River or wherever you're coming from. We fed you, we took care of you, we showed you, gave you the resources that you need, but then you eventually would go home. if you're there for cultural, if you're there for ceremonies. A lot of these things are really entwined of how we know of our way of being. And so I think that now that because of just so much of the harm that's being done to our relatives down south, across the world, that a lot of that has been lost. And it's just like, well, let's just go way back to when we actually had a sort of understanding of what it means to be, O'odham, but also taking care of our relatives. And so I think that's a big step to where we need to go, because we've already, if I think what we've seen is all of these things that just don't work for us, that don't work towards taking care of our relatives, seeing our relatives die, seeing people dealing with a lot of traumatic events, losing their family, their friends, people who've been to Autumn, who've been to Palestine, don't know if those people who were their visitors are alive anymore. Um, like that's just insane. It's just a lot of that has affected our people, because in those solidarity efforts, now that we've met people, like I know like a lot of people who went to Palestine, and they're like, hey, I don't even know if they're alive right now. Like when I was touring Palestine, we learned so much in this solidarity effort, and now I don't even know if they're alive, just because of the US having their hand in a lot of these things. And when people say like, well, what does it have to do with indigenous people? Well, there we go. Because we're there for a reason. We're there because we want to see what it's like on that side, because a lot of it is so similar to what's happening here. And the evidence is there. The media, the documentation, or our people that have been there, often people who've been there, can testify to this. And I'm sure that we have Palestinian relatives here that have that strong connection to us, and what we're seeing that in these solidarity efforts is that connection. And because they're watching their friends die, because it's a community. We're a community of Autumn, and we want to build that community, and we're seeing our friends going through this turmoil. And, those folks who have been there are also losing their loved ones. It doesn't matter if we're blood related or not, we see them as our relatives. And when one is gone, it's a family member. Your family member is gone. You know, and so that's what I think, that's what's just been overlooked and always criticized by folks who don't understand that worldview of indigenous worldview and relationship. And I think that's just what we're seeing now. It's just that erasure of giving people their humanity back. And yeah, so
It's really beautiful, Napoleon. Just the way you're talking about things so blatantly and just clearly, like, I feel like on this podcast we don't always, sometimes we over intellectualize things, and with this it's like offensive to reduce it to a political issue, or to make it seem like you need to have all this expertise to understand, because you truly don't. You just need to have a heart. And like I'm interested in um you kind of talking more about those moments of solidarity with Palestinian relatives, right? So like the delegations to Palestine, and also like kind of hearing more about how the settler entity of Israel directly impacts Ottoman land and people, because that's, I think, something that people here in the US fail to realize. It's like Israel's committing a genocide, right, against Palestinian people right now, that is fully with the support and funding with the US, right? It would be impossible for them to do what they're doing without US tax dollars. And so, but another thing that I think people miss is that Israel actually has a hand in displacing and genociding many other indigenous people in many other parts of the world right now, including us, including Ottoman people, um, including you know, uh, people in African countries who are victimized by the diamond trade that Israel is directly profiting from. Like, right? Israel has its hand in so many other things all over the world, even in South America. And so I feel like I want to hear you unpack that a little more, but also um, kind of just getting to the point of reminding people that Israel has its money, its funding, and its tactics from the United States. They looked at the United States playbook and how they treated us, how they developed federal Indian policy to create their genocidal, settler colonial project. And so what is happening in Palestine, like, this shit is directly derivative of the genocide that has been waged against us, that continues to be waged against us, right? And yeah, I just want to kind of hear you expand on that.
The impacts of Israel on well, obviously, I mean, a lot of folks who come back from Palestine, they what we've seen, or relatives that I've talked to who've been on the ground there. Obviously, there's the wall. There's a different, like I talked about, the IFT towers, or the Greater Fix Towers, which is a continual project, by the way. Um, a lot of folks who have been talking about that area, different villages that are under the surveillance right now, probably will eventually get more surveilled. um, I think that it's that, just the infrastructures that they've built, and then obviously the checkpoints and everything. But I think the biggest hand, without people even realizing it, is that our tribal governments are afraid to say anything about the solidarity with Palestine, and I think that's the biggest part. I know there are different tribal communities who have said, "No, we stand with Palestinians," and release statements. And I think when there is silence on the tribal federal government side in our local communities, that's Israel still playing a part, because that goes back to the that still goes back to the U.S., right? That's the overseer of, like, if you say something, then we're gonna have to put in your questioning of how you're seeing um, how you're seeing your operations work. It's still the same thing as, like, the government still having operations over us, controlling it. So it's the still same thing. It's without it even being addressed. Like, there's no way that you can say anything against Israel, because that, again, you're against our government. Then you're a terrorist, or you're anti-American. So why are you speaking out on that? It's the same thing. Even when we talk about, we're against border patrol. Oh, then you're for drug cartels. Like, I think that's the biggest part that I see and others can see, is that there are we're on the fence a lot. Our who we look to, and our positions of leadership, are always just on the fence about it. And then you see other tribal communities put out, a statement. Power shout out to those communities too, because we could learn a lot from that. And if without that solid statement, at least, then I think we're just already, we have a hand in it. We're not pushing them enough. Like, they did it. They literally have just have a statement. They've done it. And what those efforts look further now is what's going to outline for the rest of us. And and I know that there's a lot of people that have trust in they don't want to say anything, or ruffle the feathers of anything. But I think without that, there's nothing that people can look towards as far as liberation, um, other than it being obviously direct action, things of that nature. But when people don't have that sort of backup or anything like that in solidarity, then it's like, well, we're letting colonialism settlers still continue the harm in our communities, and you will allow someone, if you had a Palestinian relative, you're allowing that violence to continue. You're allowing that violence to continue in any aspect of the area that we consider our home. You're allowing them to spit on you and spit on our relatives, because there's not that sort of protection or understanding of what do you mean with solidarity tactics. And then it just builds from there. Then it goes to the infrastructure. Then it goes to continuing getting funding. They Because immigration now is a bunch of folks now, not just Mexico, but now we're seeing people coming in from other countries. Palestinians, what could that look like 10 years from now if we're saying, oh, well, we already have these policies in state. It works over there in Israel. So now let's put it towards a policy specifically for Palestinian people because now we're seeing, the solidarity efforts with Indigenous people. So now let's start having these other ways of really putting our infrastructures on our lands to keep people being surveilled, you know, and people just live there. I have friends who just live right next to a tower not far. Grandma, grandpa, they don't know what's going on half the time, and I think that's how Israel really does, that sort of militarization, um, and the U.S. work on that and that sort of building that infrastructure, whatever it may be, wall, patrol, um, and any more sense of that. And now it's just gone into our tribal governments. They're scared. They're scared. Don't want to say anything, and I think that's a big part of how they're continuing the settler colonial, narrative, in a lot of ways. So yeah, thank you for that question.
Thank you for your response. It gets me to something that we talk about a lot, and that is that fear that tribal leaders have. It's ironic because it's the ones who are so willing to defend the United States. Oh, they're the good guys. What would we do without them? But then it's like, okay, if they're so good and they support us so much and they understand us so much, they just love their Indians so much, then why are you scared to put your foot down? Are you afraid that they're going to retaliate? Are you afraid they're going to do something horrible to us? Are you afraid they're going to cut our federal monies? Are you afraid they're going to start desecrating our lands if we do put our foot down? If that's the case, you can't have your cake and eat it too, right? You admit that these are the bad guys and that you are afraid, you are cowering, or you take your power back for real and you actually fight it and you actually defend yourself. And like it's possible to acknowledge the truly horrific reality of what they can do to us, what they have done to us, and still fight back, right? And I think that's like the hard that's what I know, Napoleon. That's like one of the hardest things that we're always up against as organizers. Like is getting our tribal government to take principled positions that are actually in line with our core values, that are actually putting humanity first and not the interests of the United States and its money first.
Exactly, and that was always a question when I was learning a lot about the border and everything. And one of my professors was saying that what would that look like? What would that sort of it's like the reimagining of the nation, Tohono nation or O'odham in general took over and started having that sort of taking the leadership role in that, and what would that look like? And a lot of people were looking at it towards like these like logistical federal policies, but it's just sort of like no, we just have to look back to what we did before, and taking care of one another. And I think that's what just is tainted a lot of the tribal governments. A lot has been, we have these legalities that are not ours, by the way, that are pushed upon us, and we can just reinvent the wheel. We can just do that to them. So because we want to protect our communities, and like you mentioned, like they've already done that to us. They've cut funding, or I mean, but there's just so many things, layers that we've already been impacted by, and without that kind of understanding of what that looks like to have a reimagining of leadership, of trying to help our relatives get back home, then it just feels like we're reinventing the wheel in a lot of ways. Because I don't see, as of right now, it's hard to predict what, left and right, because of different people's politics and where they stand. I know there are more progressive, quote unquote progressive people who want to say one thing and say, yeah, we should definitely stand with solidarity with Palestine, and then not have that, and not do anything, and it's just that continuous push. And so, because of people who have been in leadership offices forever, they kind of have grown up into that sort of way of reinventing the wheel a lot of colonization and settler colonialism a lot. And kind of because I always ask the same question is like, how many, 15 years ago was the same, now it's the same. What is continuously, is it just what is that continuously, that continuation of that wheel, and how does it, why does it keep getting reinvented? Why haven't we broken it? We do direct action, we do all these things, we push them, we embarrass them, we put them on blast. Like, how do these keep growing up? Like, how does this keep growing? And it's a lot of that. We vote in the same people, we get people from our communities that are the same people with the same politics, and it's just a never ending cycle, you know and I think that's what we have to continuously try to push towards, just the breaking of that wheel.
Absolutely. And I think another thing that's like when I'm thinking about tribal leaders, I'm like, they do really depend on us giving them power, right? They have, their elections or whatever, but uh, you know, they depend on our validation because they know that the United States doesn't value them, right? I'm forever talking about the way people come home and act power hungry because of the way they feel so belittled and devalued after those meetings with like representatives from, the whoever administration that's currently in power, because it really, really is so sobering. It's like you actually don't have power for shit. So what do? They come back home and they bully their people and they bully their families and they so they can feel a little bit of superiority when it's so very clear to them how inferior the United States and its officials see them as. And it's wild how they will take like personal insecurities on that level and literally let that be the foundation of how they govern us or fail to govern us too, right? And just the profound ignorance that comes with like anti-migrant sentiment, right? Literally, like we have more in common with every migrant who crosses that border than we ever will with any of these US administrators higher up, than we ever will with even a middle class, upper middle class individual. Like it's so wild to me to see this type of mindset. And then the where I'll end here on this little rant is like whenever we suggest defending ourselves, right? Whenever we suggest fighting back, people always want to say, "Oh, well, why do you have a victim mindset?" And I'm like, fighting back is a victim mindset. I feel like accepting you, right? People who accept, oh, well, that's just the way things are. Well, what are we gonna do about it? If that's not a victim mindset, I don't know what is. Like, be so serious.
Thinking that someone is going to step on your neck and you have no way, I guess I'm just going to die then, without pulling that off. It's just like, no, like, they're hurting you. Why would you do that? And it's the same thing. It's just, we're seeing our communities go through it. You're seeing our relatives go through it. We can't have them do that anymore. There's a certain point, you can't suffocate yourself. You can't take it. Whether it is just as tribal leader, and I shout out to a lot of the folks who do challenge those, because direct action and everything that is happening isn't easy. They don't just go up and just be like, all right, yeah, let's do this. It takes a whole community and foundation of where you're going to push to the end goal, if there's any. And that's where it's being tired of being bullied around. It's being tired of being pushed to the limit. It's tired of being, the same things that were that whole wheel thing. And I think that's like it's an amazing point, that because I don't know where that, I don't know what it is, but it's that's exactly what I found as well. Is like, what are you scared of? So I think that's a good point, and that's where I think we're just really built to that, kind of notion of where we're going for is what solidarity looks like.
Yeah, because like, and I also don't want to come off like, oh, I'm just shitting on like, yeah, I'm obviously very critical of tribal leaders, but like, I say this to hopefully get people to come to the conclusion that like, well, maybe we do have more power than we think. And I think tribes like yours and like mine probably have the most power because of our location, because of our proximity to critical US military infrastructure. And they know that. And we are the last people that they want to feel empowered, because the second we are, we can cause very serious and real damage to the settler machine, to the settler colonial infrastructure, to the machine, ideologically and physically, right? And I think tribal leaders, to some extent, probably understand that too, and they know that that's scary, and people should take seriously what that means and the implications for it. But they should also have the courage to imagine a future in which that power can literally free us, and not just us, literally everybody else, including non-human relatives, right? Including, like, right, the animal relatives who can't migrate the way they used to, and including the animal and plant relatives who can't grow in irradiated sites on my land, right? Like, they know that we hold a lot of power, and I think our tribal leaders need to realize that too. I think they are, to some extent, afraid of their own power, and, like, I'm critical of tribal leaders in this way, and I'm sure you are too. Not to just put them down, but to hopefully inspire people to think differently, or to think about a bigger picture, right? Because so often, organizations like yours or like mine and plenty of others, they represent the people of these nations, right? In doing, like, solidarity work, in pushing back against extractive industries and things like that. And they don't always represent what the tribal government is doing. But what if we could all be on the same page? What if the tribal governments did really push and support these fights? And what if multiple tribal governments did? And what if there was regional support for these things? And what if they became popular movements? And what if there was legislation being put out? And, like, that is what I'm getting at when I'm making these critiques of tribal leadership. And like I said, I'm sure it's similar for you too. We're not shitting on them for the sake of shitting on them. Like, we envision greater things. And, like, my only wish is to inspire and empower people enough to envision these bigger things as well.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And obviously, people around our generation, they want us to speak up more and do things and understand the way things are. And when we have these platforms and things of organizing, those are ways of how we're trying to voice our opinions. Um, so I think it's a big a strength of courage that when it takes what we're doing on these different platforms, whether it's physically being on episodes and things that are voicing our opinion, and how we can envision a better future for our next generation. I think what we always come back in on is like, yeah, like, well, what are you doing? What are you doing to help support and all these other things? This is we're doing this. We're doing actions. We're doing educational groups. We're organizing in different spaces, and I think that's just overlooked all the time. We have people of our generation, of our age groups, doing a lot more and being involved a lot more than there ever was, especially when it comes to stuff going on globally, being very consciously aware about what's going on in your backyard, and then also remembering that there are relatives that deal with similar situations and deal with similar impacts across the globe. And I think that's what always gets kind of lost in a lot of conversations with tribal leaders, is because they think, well, we're just being rowdy or whatever, but without sitting down and actually listening and having a conversation. And I think that just relates to even like with my son. We're arguing, but do we ever sit down and have an actual conversation, talk about what we're moving towards? And working through these problems. So when I think about, like you mentioned, the what if we were on the same page? I think that is definitely has definitely been an interesting conversation, because one of the things is like, we could And then there are others who believe that we could, to a certain point, to a certain extent. I think there should be boundaries set, um, just because of the ways that we do things. Um, I think it's interesting. Um, yeah, yeah. Let's all be on one, one particular, um, ideology, one understanding of what we're wanting to get towards, and then others will be like, well, I think we should set boundaries. Tribal government, don't obviously represent the entire people. So I think that's where the boundaries could be, is where we have an understanding, and here's what we're going at it, and here's where we need support, and vice versa. Because I think that there's, just because of the the way that it's set up right now, I think that there nearly is not as much support around certain tactics and strategies versus other tactics and strategies. So I think that can, but as long as that there's that sort of interconnected ways of just not being through one aid, but through other ways too, that where it really can impact um, a lot of people's, at least giving people hope, people understanding um, of where we're coming from. Um, and so I think that that's a big part of it, because with the question about, well, what is a border, no border look like? What is that? What does that entail? And it goes back to that. Well, if we have tribal governments taking leadership, you know, we also need community. We also need um, actions. We also need people who can be able to be on frontline support. We need a lot of that people have already built, and have a critique about where we can go from that. It's not just, okay, yeah, we're taking care of our relatives, but what are we doing to protect a lot of ourselves and our relatives, and continuously work towards that? And that's where grassroots organizations have always been so impactful, because they understand what it's like to be in that situation, and also getting out of that situation, and helping others who are under some sort of same scope of what it's like. Um, you know, being arrested, people. The simplest way of an example, people being on those front lines that are able to teach others about, what is their humanity, and what it's like when people cross those boundaries. So I think there's a lot that we can work towards, as far as like with tribal governments and grassroots organizations, and if they're willing to listen. And I think that's where another big part of where we can sort of voice a lot of our change, and whether we if they listen or not, we still do what we got to do. We still do it. So yeah.
Yep, we're making those moves regardless. And it's just ironic because they always follow us at the end of the day, right? Like, we're just rowdy troublemakers, but once we actually get that steam and we get that support and we're making those differences and we're getting that media coverage, here they come running, right? To throw in their support at the last minute.
The photo op, yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, so we should never underestimate, the humble work that we do either. And I really appreciate what you were saying about the diversity of tactics, which is so important, right? A lot of revolutionaries say by any means necessary, but they don't unpack what that means. That does mean literally by any means, even if it's not so glamorous or pretty, or it's not the fun stuff like going out and hitting the streets, right? Sometimes it's the really boring paperwork kind of stuff that you're doing too. And then also just, reminding people that what works for us is going to look different everywhere. Like, we can't apply one same template to every tribe and think that's going to work in freeing them, which is, essentially kind of how tribal governments are set up now, right? During the, with the installation of like the IRA and the IRA template that we all have, the Howard Wheeler Act, like tribal governments have the same standard template for the most part. A lot of us have, like the federal government side, and as well as like a traditional government too, right? And so, like, just thinking about what it would look like if we got to create our own governments, our own policies, our own structures based on our own core values and our unique epistemologies and cosmologies, like how different that would look from what we have now and what we're calling our tribal governments. And I think that applies very much to what's happening in Palestine too, right? Where they have, the PA was installed, the Palestinian Authority was installed, which Palestinians on multiple occasions have compared to tribal governments once we tell them what our tribal governments are like. It's like, oh, it's just an extension of the settler government. And it's like, yeah, pretty much. And, looking at what the PA is doing right now. They're assisting in the genocide, right? And my fear is that that's what tribal governments will do when things really get rough here. At which point, who's going to come and take power, and who are the people going to put their power behind, or who are people going to put their support behind? The resistance groups. And so, seeing how things are playing out in Palestine too right now has been very eye opening to me, and just really, really making me think about what our duties and obligations here are as Native people to ourselves, but also to everyone else, right? To the people struggling in Gaza, to people being forced out of their homes because of climate crisis and economic and social strife. Like, I'm just thinking, like, what can we do to take this into our hands and just help start building that better future for ourselves and for everyone.
Yeah, for sure. And uh, there was what you mentioned about those epistemologies and things. That's where a lot of people get the academic work and things of that nature of like those different worldviews, and just sitting down and even listening to those types of stories from Palestinians and folks who have came their lineage tracing back to what does home mean, to what does home feel like again. I think there's so many documentaries um, that sort of give you a scope of what it's like, and the history of land. And that's what it really comes down to is in a lot of these documentaries is about land. And I always mention when you mention about direct action and stuff, I always think of the no dapple, because you mentioned different tactics, and I'm like, we can't have something like a gathering out in the desert. That's different terrain. It's different. It's hot as hell. Like, we can't house people were saying, yeah, we need to occupy the wall and stuff. Maybe there has to be a really strategic way of what we do things with, especially with different tactics. Because the terrain, it all goes back to the land. And it will speak to you in ways you be there, you shouldn't be there. And I think with a lot of the hurt that is happening, and the connections that's happening, is also a part of that epistemology. Is like how the land is hurting, and then how the people are hurting. So obviously, what we're seeing across with Palestinian folks and our relatives, you know, they're losing friends, family members, and we've lost people here on this side. The land has been taken. The land is in parts are desecrated in our areas. So we see the same thing sort of happening. So there's always that. Can't forget about the land and how that's being impacted, and the ways that it's being impacted. Things are being destroyed that are they can't be replaced. People's homes, people's generations of their knowledge there are gone, just as similar as generations of our homelands have been sliced. Just like this border. It impacts our traditional knowledge. It impacts our ways of being. A lot of the time, a lot of the relatives that say when they go out to Palestine, come back, is how there's always just this gray area in different areas, and there's the wall and different other things that are impacted, and very similar to what it looks like when Palestinian folks come here, and they're like, "Wow, this is very similar. It just takes a different form, and it's all about the terrain. It's all about where they're located, you know." And it definitely like that for different tribal communities, like you mentioned. The terrain is very different. How we deal with the area where we're at, you know. It was like I've always looked at Palestine and then like the Gaza Strip. I was like, wow, that's so small. But then like when we were comparing it to different communities, like different tribal nations, that is literally a community, you know. So it's like thinking, putting that in perspective of like, what is that, say if things went crazy out in the border and then things started happening there, that would literally be like 50% of our people. Um, so it's just trying to like put those into really like visuals and understanding that sort of impacts. I think is really also important too, to really get a full grasp on how the land is impacted, um, and we can't leave that out because I think that's what we all, that's our strength, and I think with Palestinian relatives and us is that. And when we go back to histories and things, that's what it began with, was the land. So that's where we connect our stories.
Absolutely. And yeah, I mean, for Indigenous people everywhere, when we say we are the land is us, it's not an exaggeration at all. And that's something that our Palestinian relatives are always reminding us about, right? That's why they have Land Day. Like, the land itself is a relative. The land itself um, is something that we understand we have a responsibility to caretake as well. And when it is quite literally desecrated, right, by something like a wall or a bomb or nuclear waste or the remnants of getting carpet bombed just nonstop, that affects the land forever. And that affects the land in ways, like you said, it's irreplaceable. And so I think at the core of this too, and in coming to find these solutions, literally working with the earth and listening to the earth is going to be our saving grace. And that's what settler entities don't understand. They think that they're going to win by sheer force of, sheer power and violence and bombs and guns, but they don't realize that they actually need the land and the earth to claim them as a relative as well for them to succeed, and that is not going to happen. Um, and so when things really get tough and it's hard to stay positive, that's something that I try to remind myself, is that we already have this relationship established that settlers and settler entities don't, and it's simply our responsibility to upkeep that and to take seriously that obligation, and to look past the money that's waved in our face in the present moment too, right, when it comes to defending the land. My last question for you, just so we could wrap up soon, we've been on for about an hour, is what can people do to educate themselves or take action right now, specifically in supporting O'odham people and the biggest issues impacting them right now?
I think supporting a lot of the autumn led groups that we have out there during the direct action. They're on social media, a lot of holding space for Palestinian relatives to tell their story, and then build that connection, to keep asking questions. How is this similar to what we're facing out there for autumn relatives as well? And dig more and get more information on the integrated fixed towers and how those impact a lot of our community. Because without that knowledge, you kind of lose about, you can't really get into the our story of existence and continuing that existence without the ugly parts of it. So I would suggest just getting more education on those and asking people who are actually from, the Don Autumn Nation or Autumn communities who've experienced some of these discriminations and things of that nature, because it's not the same. Me and then others, we've all experienced um, the what is it? We've all experienced without consent, and a lot of times when we're out there, whatever we're doing traditionally, culturally, spiritually, it's always a sense of being watched and what that looks like. Understanding, obviously, being a male, and then obviously others who don't identify, that there's also violence in that nature and that impact as well. So I would suggest, people getting that research, going to um, these solidarity, the- these solidarity events. They're not events, these just these solidarity actions, I should say, and awareness that people are always asking questions. So I attend those, supporting those who are obviously who live out there. Just being a relative again. I think it's also another thing is just being a good relative, understanding where people are coming from, meeting them where they're at, and understanding that this is having that hope of this isn't forever. That we're going to obviously overcome a lot of these things and build that solidarity in some way or another. We've always found a way. We've always been in solidarity with our relatives and things of that sort of in that sort of way. And what that looks like is for you to make that stance on your own. Whether you want to show up, whether you want to, do a lot of these things to help support is just it's just getting that knowledge of understanding. I think that's the first step. That's the very first step, because if you don't have a direction, if you're just going in to just take a photo, or just be like, oh yeah, I met an Autumn person, that was cool, then you're not going to really get anywhere. You're not really going to know what solidarity looks like. Or even if you don't speak to our Palestinian relatives and how what they're going through, then they really don't have any direction towards that liberation. Because there's no this talk of restoration. I keep hearing a lot. Oh, well, we're going to have this resolution. Oh, this is what resolution. There's no resolution until there's like a liberation of indigenous people and vice versa, Palestinian people. There is no resolution, so you can't say one here, then not the other. It has to be both. And without that, then you really have no, it's hard to talk about it because it's always going to be brought up. There's no resolution, or those things you put in these policies that are, if you're going to do one thing here, you have to look there, you have to also look here. So I think that's our biggest, what I would say is the biggest standpoint of where solidarity comes for both us Autumn and Palestinians, or relatives too. So I would say a lot of those things. And then um, we had a recent episode, well, in November, uncovering shared struggles on our Don Autumn Young Voices podcast. And I would emphasize to listen to that also, because we had Dr. Christopher Wise, who he's a he's kind of been through. He does a lot of research pertaining to land in different countries and their relationship. And then Amy Wan, who's a huge activist, a huge Autumn voice that was actually out there in Palestine, did some work, has always dedicated her life to a lot of solidarity work with Palestinians. So I'll definitely um, take a listen to that. And I was given the privilege to talk to both of them and get that hope. When out of this episode, um, you'll get some like background history, but I think what this episode really focuses on is the hope. Like where do we find that we're seeing all this stuff happening, social media, the news, like where's that hope? Where does that come from? Or for us as indigenous people who aren't able to be in direct solidarity all the time. And so this episode really focuses on the hope aspect of what these challenges are, what you can do, just to kind of give you this like, state of mind where you can function, because it impacts everyone differently. To a point, people can't even, turn on the TV or find anything. So I would definitely take a listen to that. It's our episode 40. And it's I really am proud to be a part of that episode, because it really entails that, because we've always have the battles and everything that we face, but what does that look like to have hope and solidarity with Autumn and Palestinian um, today and then for the future as well? So I would say those types of that episode will really help folks who want to dig a little bit deeper.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And just very last thing, where can our listeners follow you, keep up with your work, name drop your orgs, name drop any orgs you think our listeners should be following, or, shout out any resources you think people should look at.
Yeah, so I mean, the I've been a part of the Tohono Young Voices podcast. So take a look at some of our episodes that also go into um, other topics too. And for me, I'm starting over. I'm starting a podcast, but I haven't really fleshed it out yet. But it's called Over 500 Years Podcast, and that'll be launched sometime whenever I have some free time. And then social media is just Napoleon underscore 2061 if you want to follow anything that I'm doing. Um, I want to shout out the Autumn Solidarity groups out there, the anti-colonial antis. Um, there's a lot of solidarity work with Indigenous women, Autumn women, that are happening right now. They're on Instagram if you want to find a lot of their work and what they're continuously doing out in the so-called Phoenix area, Tucson area, and then shout out the AZ to Palestine, Tucson Palestinian networks, like a lot of those folks who are continuously working with Autumn. Because I don't think I've ever seen right now the strength of the two groups being together than what it is right now. It's a truly beautiful thing that we're inviting Palestinians. Where Palestinians are having us there, Indigenous women and others who are entailed to that area. So I think give those a follow. Look up those AZ to Palestine solidarity groups too, because once you get in contact with them, you'll hear all them people around there and speaking, and that's where you'll get that connection too. So yeah, I think that's about it for my plugins, and just shout out to everyone out there and hope that they can, under these intense times, that they can find some movement that what we were putting on, or something of that nature that kind of helps ease a lot of the pain. And then that yeah, and then obviously um, contact me if you want. I'm sure we can put some um, email addresses or anything else to kind of get involved. If you want to do an episode on our podcast or do something in correlation with that. So yeah, thank you.